So let's look at some potential moves that could make sense for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So let's look at it here. Let's start with number 1, and that's William Eklund and Ty Dellandrea to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for Calle Jarnkrok and Easton Cowan. So I think when you look at this trade, it's a bit interesting. People might get mad at me, but William Eklund, let's just put it this way. He's more prepared for the National Hockey League. He's already a guy that put up some better numbers last year. He's young enough in his earlier 20s that I think he could be a core player for the Toronto Maple Leafs in the top 6, top 9, basically what you're contributing, and understand that Easton Cowan, as much as he could be a contributor next year, he's not going to be seasoned. A lot of people are putting way too much expectation on him. That's my worry for Easton Cowan right off the bat for the Leafs. I see how fans are talking about him and acting like he's going to somehow come in as the savior. He played a lot of games. Yes, he broke OHL records. He broke London Knights records. I get all that. He did play a lot of games. He went to 2 finals. He was good in those finals. But when it came down to the World Juniors, best on best, he was a little invisible. I'm worried about the pressure that's being put on Easton Cowan right now. William Eklund, high former first-round pick. I think he's already showing progress. You throw him in a line with William Nylander, I think the fellow Swedes could figure it out. I don't mind this trade. I think it gets rid of the Calle Jarnkrok. You could probably even include the David Kampf contract in here, frankly. And you get rid of those contracts. You get William Eklund, who I think is going to be a stud top 6 forward. And Easton Cowan joins some London Knights prospects in Haltonen and in Sam Dickinson. So there's some familiarity there as well in San Jose. So I think that one makes some sense. That one might be disagreed upon just on the fact that Leaf fans don't want to lose Cowan. But let's look at another one where I think it showed that the Leafs defense was the least of their problems in the playoffs and throughout the season, what they built up. The Buffalo Sabres, they want some guys to help out in their defense group, specifically a shutdown right shot defenseman. So I'm thinking, hey, why don't we look at a scenario where the Buffalo Sabres and Toronto Maple Leafs make a trade? I'm not saying it has to be Carlo and Ekman-Larsson. It can be Carlo and another piece. But I think Carlo would be a perfect fit next to Power or Dahlin. Alex Tuch, who's going to be a UFA in a year, Alex Tuch would be the perfect bite kind of player the Toronto Maple Leafs need in that forward group. Score some goals, has that bite, has that size. If I'm the Toronto Maple Leafs, I go, hey, Buffalo Sabres, we could help you out. We have this shutdown right shot guy that we just paid a first and Minton for. If you can give us a player that we feel comfortable, that we would have been fine with giving Minton in a first for, we'll do that deal. That could be Alex Tuch. I think any Leaf fan you talk to, if you were looking at Tuch and looking at what he could be a fit for this team at $4.8 million, if you were confident you could also sign him to an extension beyond this year, I think you're willing to trade Minton in a first for that guy. So my conversation is this. Are the Leafs comfortable enough with signing a different offensive defenseman than Ekman-Larsson, or just take OEL out of this deal, attach Carlo with maybe another draft pick, like a second-round pick, or one of their B-level prospects? And I think Carlo fills a massive need for the Buffalo Sabres on that right side. And if they believe they're not going to be able to re-sign Tuch, they already have so many top 9 and top 6 forwards that they could lose a guy like Tuch in terms of the offensive production and get a much-needed defense presence in Carlo, like I said, to play on the right side next to Dahlin or Power. I think that makes a lot of sense for the Buffalo Sabres. And I think the Toronto Maple Leafs need a guy like Alex Tuch in their lineup. So that would be part of that kind of culture change and getting Tuch at a reasonable cap hit. And then think about it. If you get Tuch through a trade and then sign like a Besser for $8 to $9 million, Besser and Tuch will be the same overall cap hit just about as a Mitch Marner. I'm using Besser as an example, but there's some wingers out there in free agency that will probably make anywhere from the $7 to $9 million range. You attach that to Tuch, you've got your $14 million of 2 legit top 6 forwards instead of signing 1 to $14 million. Now let's look at a couple others. This one's really interesting. It's a bit of a blockbuster, but it could make sense for both sides. So for the Toronto Maple Leafs and Calgary Flames, it's hard to see here, but there is a first-round pick down here. So it's a first, a third, Robertson, Kampf, Danford, Benning, for Rasmus Anderson, 50% retained. So I'm going to pull it up here in a more clear sense so you guys can see it more clearly. But I think that one's interesting for a couple reasons. If the Calgary Flames are looking at things as, okay, we want to get younger, Ben Danford, as that's an example, Ben Danford is a good example of a guy that is probably going to be like the next Chris Tanev, or he's probably going to, like, he's not the most offensive, explosive guy, but I think the biggest thing to look at there is that he is going to be probably that complement to your offensive number one guy. And I think that's the big part of it. So I don't think the sizing really changed, but there is a first round pick here, guys. There's a third, and then Robertson, Danford as the main pieces. You're getting Rasmus Andersson. The only way you're doing this is in Toronto's perspective, is if you feel you want more offense from the back end. And I actually think this could be a secondary trade to the trade I just showed you guys. So if the Buffalo Sabres and Toronto Maple Leafs made a trade, the Leafs acquire Alex Tuch, you probably want a guy coming back. And then in this scenario, if you did the two trades this offseason with Calgary and Buffalo, this is an example because I think they got to make two major trades, trading a core player maybe, or trading kind of what I just talked about, maybe like a position of strength. So there's been conversation recently of the Leafs trading one of their goaltenders. I don't know if I agree with that. So maybe they trade one of their defensemen. Carlo would be a huge asset to the Buffalo Sabres. You bring in Tuch, and then you trade a bunch of your assets. Yeah, it would be a 2028 future first-round pick. That's risky for the Leafs. Top 5, protect that. You get Rasmus Andersson at 50% retained. Hopefully he re-signs in Toronto. And then you could look at a top 4 of Jake McCabe and Rasmus Andersson, and then Morgan Rielly and Chris Tanev. That's pretty solid. That's really solid. So I think in that aspect, the Leafs are a lot more comfortable where they're at in the defense group. And then I think you have the conversation of what your bottom pair is. If you go out and get another guy, or it could be Benoit on that third pair still, who's obviously really strong. So I think when you talk about the Toronto Maple Leafs, it's just a matter of, do you want to trade from a position of strength to get a weakness? And that would be an Alex Tuch. I think he'd be the perfect fit for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So maybe you make a trade like this with Calgary. I've talked to some Flames fans, and they'd be willing to make a move with Toronto. I know other targets for the Leafs with Calgary would be like a Blake Coleman, or if Nazem Kadri would come back. But just to look at 3 more that I really favor in terms of partnered trades. So this is another one that might give me some heat, but this one's interesting. So I also have Yarncrow at the bottom there, but you could make this trade with just Nylander, Reeves, and Kampf. So Jackson Lacombe was just massive for the Ducks. He's going to be a top 4 defenseman long-term here. And Mason McTavish, I think, is going to be a legit either 1 or 2C. I think he could be as good as a 1C if he stays healthy. You move on from William Nylander here. Leaf fans, would you do this? I'm not sure. But I think with William Nylander, there's conversations of how tight that locker room is. If you move on from Marner, can Matthews and Nylander coexist as the 1-2 punch in Toronto? I don't know. So maybe if you're deciding, hey, Matthews is our guy, maybe you approach Nylander and go, hey, we want to give you an opportunity to be the star, the guy in another team. We need to make some changes. Would you be willing to waive to Anaheim? California, Willie, California. Maybe it's his vibe. Mason McTavish, Lacombe, that would be solving 2 things for Toronto. You get your number 1 power play guy on the back end at the top of that umbrella, and you get Mason McTavish, who could be a 1-2 punch with Austin Matthews. You always need that center depth. I think that would be a huge get for Toronto. It also saves you some cap space, because I think you'd be able to sign McTavish long-term at like $7 to $8 million per. That saves some cap space right away for Toronto this offseason, and of course, moving forward as well. Let's look at 2 more just to wrap it up. Leafs and Canucks. So I don't want to see this move happen, but it's a conversation. Would you consider trading Morgan Rielly to his hometown team, attach Cowan, and again, it's cut off here at the bottom, but Bobby McMahon is in this as well, and you get Elias Pettersson in a package deal? Rielly, Cowan, plus another significant asset that Vancouver would like. I mean, McMahon scored 20 goals. Maybe it's another piece, but Elias Pettersson at the $11.6 million cap hit, he's been a disaster for Vancouver. The value is not as high as it once was. But if you're Vancouver and you're maybe going to lose Quinn Hughes at some point, getting Morgan Rielly, who could be a top pair or top 4 defenseman, along with Easton Cowan, who's a high-end prospect, Vancouver should consider something like this, in my opinion. I know it takes them away from having a number 1 center, but there's guys in the market they could go after. They could go really aggressive after, like a Sam Bennett if they want. There's options out there. They could even go aggressive out of Mitch Marner and then try to trade for another center. Is this the most ideal scenario for Vancouver? No, but it gets them decent value back. It's a conversation. I don't know if Toronto wants to do that, but if they're moving on from Marner They need more offensive production. Elias Pettersson and William Nylander, that Swede connection, I'd be interested in looking at that as an option. I don't like trading Riley. He's been my favorite player for a long time, but it's a conversation that I'm open to having in terms of him being at home and his hometown team, a Canadian team. And I think, honestly, guys, I think Vancouver would be the only one he would even consider. I think outside of that, he wants to stay in Toronto. And last one, this is the hot take of hot takes, but I think it's a conversation that needs to happen. So let's look at it here. So let's try to shrink this so you guys can see it. Here we go. That works. So Byfield, Kempe, Deneau, Clark. Those are targets that you got to look at for Toronto if you're considering trading Auston Matthews. Auston Matthews, I think if he was going to go anywhere, he'd want to go out west closer to home. LA makes a lot of sense. They've been bumping into Edmonton, getting knocked out 4 years in a row in that first round. They need a star. They need to start center. A 1-2 punch of him and Kopitar. Byfield gets finally his chance just to be the number one center on a team. Closer to home for him as well. Kempe could partner up with Nylander on another line. So you have one line like Byfield with Nyes, and then your other line is Kempe and Nylander. You get Phil Deneau to be your third line center, dedicated third line center. So Domi your lot and don't have to take those reins. And Brandt Clark, your number one power play guy who can be offensive. He's probably not going to be like heavy 5-on-5 minutes right away, but number one power play guy. And then Matthews with Nick Robertson, some draft capital, maybe another prospect in there, but you are trading Auston Matthews, one of the best players in the game, easily a top 10 player in the game. You have to pay to get. And I think Ken Holland is the general manager that could do something like this. I truly believe. So to kind of cap off this conversation, I think if you're going to trade Auston Matthews, it's going to be to like a team like LA or Anaheim who have those big pieces. I think if you're trading with Anaheim for a guy like Matthews or Nylander, you have to bring back guys like McTavish, Lacombe, maybe another piece. And if you're LA, I'm looking at Byfield, Kempe, and Clark at the very least as well. So that's the conversation.